The circle of fifths is a visual representation of all 12 tones in music in which each note is a perfect fifth away from the previous note. Here's the major scale, also known as Ionian in the key of C. And the note at 12 o'clock is always the root of the scale. As a result, every graph must contain a note at the 12 o'clock position. So by joining the notes that belong to a scale, we get a polygon, which we call a graph. This graph represents that scale. And not just the shape of the graph, but also its orientation or rotation within the circle. In other words, the major scale is both this specific polygon at this specific angle. The cool thing is if we rotate the notes by dragging the outer controller around the circle, we get the major scale in all the different keys. You can see how the sharps needed for G major or D major are now adjacent to our graph. They now belong to our scale, while the natural notes from the previous keys move outside of the graph. So neither the shape of the polygon or its orientation within the circle are changing. If we do change the graph's position within the circle, we get all of the modes of that scale. By locking the note grouping to the graph, we get all the modes of a specific key. So, C Ionian turns into G Mixolydian, D Dorian, A Aeolian, E Phrygian, B Locrian, and then the graph flips completely. This flip occurs because there are no notes in the graph between B and F, and we get F Lydian. One more turn, and we're back in C Ionian. And if we unlock the notes from the graph, then rotate the graph alone, we get all the same modes, but with a fixed root: C Ionian, C Mixolydian, C Dorian, and so on. This is a super convenient way of representing scales because we find lots of interesting properties for each scale. For example, if we switch from note names to scale degrees, we can clearly see that Ionian is made out of just all natural or major degrees. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Rotate the graph, and you'll see that Mixolydian has a flat 7, and Dorian has a flat 7 and a flat 3, and so on. A great utility of this perspective is to see if some scale is actually the related mode of a scale that you know better. For example, let's load the altered scale. Now let's rotate the graph to see all of its related modes. We get altered, Locrian natural 9, Dorian flat 2, Mixolydian flat 13, melodic minor, and Lydian flat 7. So the altered scale is a related mode of the melodic minor scale, which we all know very well. And that's why we say the melodic minor is the source scale for this set of modes. And the altered scale is the 7th mode of melodic minor. So if we have a C altered scale, which one exactly is the source scale? Well, just lock the notes to the graph and rotate the circle until you get to the melodic minor. It's D flat melodic minor. C altered is the 7th mode of D flat melodic minor. Another benefit of graphing the scale is that you now have an unambiguous way of representing any scale in our 12-tone system. If I load the scale painter, I can try any combination of points and it will give me a valid scale, and Tessitura will find it immediately. Remember, the note at 12 o'clock must always be there since it represents the root of the scale. And there are exactly 2 to the power of 11, or 2048 possible scales, since we only have 11 nodes that we can switch on or off. And they are all inside Tessitura's scale catalog. Graphing also lets us see symmetry in scales. If I load the whole tone scale into the circle and we rotate the graph around, it becomes obvious that although this scale has 6 notes, it only yields one mode. There's only one orientation possible of this hexagon inside the circle where the top node belongs to it. That means the whole tone is symmetric with less modes than notes. Symmetric scales are also known as scales of limited transposition because they produce less than 12 note groupings. Let me show you. If I load the major scale and I rotate the outer circle, I get 12 different sets, one for each root. But if I, for example, load the augmented triad, I only get 4 note groupings. We can talk about a C augmented or an E augmented or a G sharp augmented, but we can't distinguish between them because they share the same note grouping. In other words, no matter where you stand on the circle, the graph looks the same from all 3 points. As it says in the scale companion, this is a symmetric scale with 1 mode and only 4 transpositions. And by the way, the amount of transpositions on any symmetric scale is always 12 times the amount of modes divided by the amount of notes. So the whole tone scale with 6 notes and 1 mode only has 2 transpositions. Symmetric scales are really useful for improvisation and composition. If you take a look inside the scales catalog, you'll see all scales organized by mode count. And this is not just some random choice. Viewing scales by mode count gives you all adjacent related modes, but also a clear idea of how symmetric a scale actually is. For example, in the scales with 1 mode, there are only 4 scales: the augmented triad, diminished 7, the whole tone scale, and the chromatic scale. There are no other scales in music with only 1 mode. And they're all symmetric because they have more notes than modes. In the scales with 2 modes, you can see the half diminished and the diminished scales with 8 notes but only 2 modes. And you can also see how the half diminished scale or half whole scale is the source because it's orange, while the diminished scale is just a mode. And remember, symmetric scales are scales of limited transpositions. That means they can be used over many different harmonic contexts since their roots are ambiguous. So the scales at the end of a mode count group are the most symmetric. It's worth noting how these highly symmetric scales all have the name Messiaen in them, which is a clear demonstration of how much exploration he did on symmetric scales. Another great benefit of using graphs to represent scales is that we can easily visualize them as chord scales. A chord scale is a scale paired with a chord type on the root. For example, if I pair the major scale, or Ionian, with a major 7 chord, you can see how the graph for the major triad on the root fits inside the scale. And the points that belong to both graphs are known as chord tones, while the other ones are tensions. If we look at the chord tones versus tensions in the circle, we can see that the major scale paired with a major 7 chord gives us 1, 3, 5, 7 as the chord tones, and 9, 11, and 13 as the tensions. If I pair it with a major 6 chord, then the 6 becomes a chord tone, and the 7th could now be seen as a tension. A great example is Mixolydian paired with a 7 sus4 chord. Now, the 4th is a chord tone, and the 3rd is a tension. These are powerful concepts that you can use in your playing. Like on an F7 sus4 chord, treating the 3rd as a tension to improvise your lines. The other really useful concept that you can explore with the graph is upper structures and substructures. Let's load Mixolydian. Now, let's drag a minor triad inside the substructures panel. You can see there are 3 minor triads that fit inside the scale. 1 on the 5th, 1 on the 2nd, and 1 on the 6th degree of Mixolydian. You can now use these substructures as upper structures. So, if I pair G mixo with a G7 chord, and I choose to use the minor triad on the 5th degree as an upper structure, I get a D minor over G7. Or I can use an E minor over G7. And you can explore substructures with any number of notes. Can we use a minor pentatonic? Yes, there are 3 possible minor pentatonics. So you can play E minor pentatonic on top of G7.